Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We take those dense sources, those stacks of information, and we try to pull out the core stuff you really need. And today, wow, we are tackling a truly monumental figure, Mao Zedong. His shadow, it basically dictates so much of the geopolitical reality we live in right now in the 21st century. You have to start with just the sheer scale. Think about this. It's quite dramatic. Over 1 billion people right now live in a country that was fundamentally shaped, like down to its roots, by this one man's actions. And his image, it's not history, it's current, it's potent. You see it on every single Chinese banknote. And it's looking out over Tiananmen Square, the absolute political heart of China. This isn't dusty old stuff. It's the living DNA of a global superpower.
Exactly. And that visibility, that omnipresence, that's really the key to understanding why he's so conflicted. Mao Zedong is, well, he's a paradox in history. On one hand, absolutely, he's revered, a national hero. Mm-hmm. The man who liberated China from, the humiliations of foreign imperialism. He turned it from what people called a semi-colony into a major world power. He gave people immense national pride, and there was real social progress too. But then you look at the other side of the ledger. The historical evidence just forces you to see him as one of the 20th century's most devastating tyrants. His policies led directly to the deaths of tens of millions. Catastrophic, preventable death.
Okay, so that's our mission today, and it's ambitious. How do we even start to reconcile these two Maos, the visionary? The one who pushed literacy, women's rights, unified a shattered country, and then the leader whose relentless utopian drives, his political persecutions, his frankly misguided economic policies resulted in such staggering, almost unimaginable human loss. We need to trace his path from, his peasant roots right up to the absolute peak of power. We need to look at that revolutionary fire that unified China, but also the horrific policies that came later, and why decades after he died is evaluating him still so incredibly polarizing, so strategically managed.
It's a huge task.
Let's dive in. ###II. Early life and the rise of the peasant revolutionary. Right. To get Mao the chairman, you really have to start with Mao the young man. He was born December 26, 1893, Shoshan, Hunan province. And his family background, right away, there's a kind of conflict. They were peasants, originally impoverished. But his father, Mao Yichang, was apparently quite shrewd, very disciplined, and he'd worked his way up, became one of the richer farmers in the area, maybe even feared a bit. So Mao's growing up watching this stern, successful father figure. But then his mother, Wen Qimei, she was a devout Buddhist, represented, tenderness, charity. That contrast seems to have bred something defiant in him pretty early on.
You see that defiance immediately, yeah. In his personal life, he famously rejected an arranged marriage. He was only 13, refused to even acknowledge the bride, Lu Yixiu. And that experience seems to have made him a lifelong, fierce critic of arranged marriage as an institution. And his education, same rebellious spirit. He apparently hated memorizing the classical Confucian texts, found all that rigid moral coding just stifling.
Yeah.
Instead, he was reading these classic Chinese adventure novels, things like Romance of the Three Kingdoms, Water Margin, absorbing lessons about strategy, rebellion, loyalty. And crucially, he started reading Western thought in translation, Adam Smith, Rousseau, Darwin. And he wasn't just inspired by Chinese history. He explicitly looked to Western figures like George Washington, Napoleon Bonaparte. He was like this radical intellectual sponge, just pulling ideas from everywhere.
And that sponge eventually absorbs enough to take him to Beijing. So between 1917 and 1919, he's got this pretty humble job, right? Librarian assistant at Peking University.
Yeah, seems mundane. But Peking University, then, it was the absolute hotbed of China's new intellectual movements. The May 4th movement was brewing. It was right there in the middle of it all. And what's fascinating politically is where he started. He wasn't immediately a Marxist. His first real attraction was to anarchism. Peter Kropotkin. The Chinese anarchist movement back then was incredibly progressive. They wanted to tear down all hierarchies, not just the state. They were pushing for total social revolution, including, really importantly, radical women's rights.
Okay, so if he starts there, believing in dismantling hierarchy, what flips the switch? What pushes him towards Marxism, which is, much more about centralized power?
Well, the game changer was the Russian October Revolution in 1917. That just sent shockwaves through the revolutionary world. And then he met Li Dazhao, who was one of China's very first communists, also working at the university library. Mao himself said that after that, he developed rapidly toward Marxism. So, by 1921, he's right there at the start, a founding member of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, initially, he did stick to the standard Marxist playbook. The idea that the revolution had to be led by the urban working class, the proletariat. His early work was all about organizing miners, railway workers, setting up unions, night schools, places like the Anyuan coal mines.
But China wasn't Russia, was it? It was overwhelmingly rural, millions upon millions of peasants, very few industrial workers, relatively speaking. That orthodox approach seems difficult.
Exactly. It was unsustainable. And then external events just blew it apart. For a while, the CCP had this uneasy alliance with the nationalists, the Kuomintang, the KMT, the First United Front.
That they didn't last.
No. In 1927, it shattered. Chiang Kai-shek, the KMT leader, turned on them, launched the White Terror, bloody purges, especially in Shanghai. Thousands of communists were hunted down and killed. It was a massacre.
And that forces Mao underground.
Right, underground, into the countryside. Mao led this thing called the Autumn Harvest Uprising. It failed miserably. But instead of trying to go back to the cities, which is what the Soviet advisors and the party leadership wanted, Mao did something radical. Something heretical, really, from an orthodox Marxist view. He decided the revolution's future lay with the peasantry. He'd seen their potential earlier, written about it in his Hunan report, but most communists just laughed at the idea. Peasants were supposed to be backward, passive.
But Mao saw something different.
He did. He took his battered forces up into the Jinggang Mountains, set up a rural base, a sort of Soviet, confiscated land from landlords, gave it to the peasants, and to survive, he perfected his military doctrine. Guerrilla warfare, that famous four-point strategy. When the enemy advances, we retreat. When the enemy rests, we harass him. When the enemy avoids a battle, we attack. When the enemy retreats, we advance. It was all about flexibility, using China's sheer size as a weapon.
A strategy that would face its ultimate test, wouldn't it? During the Long March. Tell us about that, the drama, the reality versus the myth.
The Long March. It starts in 1934, and let's be clear, it starts as a disaster. A total raid. The communists were trapped in their southern bases by a huge KMT encirclement campaign. They had to break out. It was a desperate, chaotic retreat. The numbers, they tell the story. Around 85,000 soldiers, maybe 15,000 party officials and cadres start the march. They crossed mountains, swamps, rivers under constant attack, battling starvation, disease, the KMT forces. It was brutal.
But politically, it was transformative.
Absolutely. Because it was during this unbelievable hardship, specifically at the Zuni Conference in January 1935, that Mao basically seized control of the party. He used the failures of the previous leadership, the success of his guerrilla tactics, to outmaneuver the Moscow-backed guys. He became the effective military and political leader, chairman of the Politburo.
And the cost in human lives.
Staggering. Only about 7,000 or 8,000 people survived the year-long ordeal to reach the new base in Shaanxi in the north. The attrition rate was over 90%. But that sheer struggle, the survival against all odds, that's what turned this military catastrophe into the CCP's foundational myth. It cemented Mao's leadership, made him seem almost superhuman, the one who could endure anything.
And right in the middle of this life-or-death struggle, there's that personal footnote. He divorces his second wife, Hizizhen, who was wounded, sent her off to Moscow, and then married Jiang Qing, the actress.
Yeah, it's a small detail in the grand sweep, but it does show even then his personal life could involve these quite sharp, decisive breaks.
Okay, so after years more of fighting, interrupted, of course, by the war against Japan, where the communists and nationalists had another uneasy truce, the Civil War kicks off again, in full force. And by 1949, Mao's armies, the PLA, they've done it. They've routed the nationalists. Chiang Kai-shek, what's left of his government, they flee to Taiwan. October 1st, 1949. That's the moment. Mao, standing on Tiananmen Gate, proclaims the People's Republic of China, and those words echo. The Chinese people have stood up. After a century of humiliation, division, war, China was finally one country under one leader. The big question was, what kind of country would it be?
Well, the immediate answer was a country established through intense violence. Mao was very clear about this. Revolution wasn't, as he said, a dinner party. It required force to consolidate power. So right away, in the early 50s, they launched massive campaigns to just obliterate the old social structure. Two main ones stand out. First, the land reform movement. This wasn't just paperwork, it was violent. Land was seized from landlords, richer peasants. They were subjected to these public humiliation trials called struggle sessions. Often they were beaten, executed on the spot by angry peasants, and then the land was divided up. Now, this did achieve a key revolutionary goal. It drastically reduced economic inequality, but also wiped out an entire social class. Millions died.
And the second campaign, the campaign to suppress counter-revolutionaries.
Exactly. This went after anyone connected to the old KMT regime, business owners, intellectuals, anyone basically deemed politically unreliable, enemies of the state. The scale of the killing here is Well, it's debated, but it's horrifying. Estimates for executions just in those first few years, 50 to 52, range from maybe 2 million up to 5 million people. Mao himself apparently mentioned a figure around 700,000 killed as counter-revolutionaries. And that's not counting the millions more. Estimates again vary, maybe 4 to 6 million sent to the Laogai. The reform through labor camps. These were brutal places. Forced labor, political indoctrination. Many died there too. It was an incredibly bloody foundation for the new China, but they saw it as absolutely necessary to secure the revolution.
Okay, but hold on. If the state is engaging in this mass violence, how does that square with the social progress you mentioned earlier? The doubling of life expectancy, literacy, it sounds completely contradictory.
It does, doesn't it? It's almost like two Chinas existing at the same time. While they were ruthlessly crushing opposition, the new government was also delivering really significant improvements for ordinary people. They tackled the opium crisis, which had plagued China for generations and pretty much eradicated it. That was huge. They rolled out basic healthcare, basic education on a massive scale. Literacy rates shot up. And yeah, that life expectancy statistic is just incredible. It nearly doubled in that period. You just don't see public health gains like that very often in history. They also made big strides in women's rights, outlawing practices like foot binding, promoting equality in marriage, at least on paper.
So it's building and destroying simultaneously.
Precisely. Rapid industrialization, too, especially with Soviet help in the first five-year plan. Factories, infrastructure, but always alongside the political terror, the suppression. It's this dual legacy that makes them so hard to pin down.
And this period also sees the beginnings of that intense personality cult and a particularly chilling political maneuver, the 100 Flowers campaign. Things started to harden politically, didn't they?
They did. After the initial consolidation, the political climate got much tighter. In 1956, Mao launched the 100 Flowers campaign, famous slogan. Let 100 flowers bloom. Let 100 schools of thought contend. The official line was, we welcome criticism. Tell us how the party can improve. And many intellectuals, even party members, they actually believed it. They spoke out honestly, criticizing bureaucracy, corruption, lack of freedom.
But it was a trap.
A devastatingly effective trap. Almost immediately, Mao slammed the brakes. He declared the criticisms had gone too far. They were attacks by rightists trying to overthrow the system. And then came the backlash. The anti-rightist campaign of 1957. Hundreds of thousands, maybe 500,000 intellectuals, artists, officials who had spoken out were persecuted, sent to labor camps, lost their jobs, publicly shamed. Many never recovered.
Wow.
It silenced dissent completely. It showed everyone the limits. Criticize it, fine. But crock the line, Mao's line, and you'd be crushed. It cemented his absolute ideological control.
And that control gets amplified. Visually, ideologically. We see the posters, the slogans like Chairman Mao is the red sun in our hearts, and of course the ultimate symbol.
The Little Red Book. Quotations from Chairman Mao Zedong, published in '64, little pocket-sized book. Became virtually mandatory. You had to have it, study it, quote it. It was the Bible of Maoism.
And this ideological certainty, this intensity, it played out on the world stage too, in the Cold War.
Oh, absolutely. China's intervention in the Korean War in 1950 was a massive statement, huge cost in lives, probably at least 180,000 Chinese soldiers died. And it led to decades of hostility with the U.S., trade embargoes, the works. But maybe the defining geopolitical move was the split with the Soviet Union.
Right, the two communist giants falling out. What drove that?
It started brewing in the late 50s, especially after Khrushchev came to power in Moscow. Khrushchev started talking about peaceful coexistence with the West, and he criticized Stalin's excesses. Mao saw this as betrayal, revisionism. He thought the Soviets were going soft, losing their revolutionary edge. Moscow, in turn, thought Mao was reckless, too radical, potentially dragging them into conflicts. There were border disputes too, but fundamentally it was ideological. Who was the true leader of world communism?
And that split had huge consequences.
Massive. It isolated China. But it also forced them to become self-reliant. That's when they really pushed their own nuclear program, the 2 bombs, 1 satellite project. A huge achievement, developing nuclear weapons and satellites pretty much on their own. And paradoxically, that split eventually opened the door for the U.S. Nixon's visit in 1972. The Americans saw a chance to play China off against the Soviets. It completely reshaped the Cold War landscape.
Okay, so we've seen Mao the unifier, the nation builder, albeit with a very heavy, often brutal hand. But now we pivot. Because despite those early successes, Mao wasn't satisfied. He felt China wasn't moving fast enough. He wanted this leap into a communist utopia. And this is where things get, frankly, really horrifying.
January 1958, Mao launches the Great Leap Forward, the idea to catapult China past Britain and America industrially in just a few years. How? By merging all the small farms into these massive people's communes? Total collectivization.
It was pure revolutionary fervor, completely detached from economic reality. The plan was basically to siphon everything from the countryside to fuel industrial growth. Huge numbers of peasants were pulled off farming. They were sent to work on these giant infrastructure projects, dams, canals, often badly planned. Or even worse, they were told to build steel in their own backyards.
The backyard furnaces, yeah, I've read about that. It sounds insane.
It was. Mao became obsessed with steel output as a measure of progress. Peasants who knew nothing about metallurgy were ordered to build these tiny, crude furnaces. They melted down everything metal they could find, their farming tools, their cooking pots, wokes, even door handles, and the result: tons of completely useless, brittle pig iron. Just waste. But in the process, they destroyed the very tools they needed to farm.
And on top of this technical disaster, you had immense political pressure, didn't you?
Terrible pressure. Local officials were terrified. Remember the anti-rightist campaign? No one wanted to be labeled a slacker or a doubter. So to please their superiors, to show revolutionary enthusiasm, they started lying. Wildly. About grain harvests. They reported absolutely fantastical yields, numbers that were physically impossible, double, triple, 10 times the actual harvest.
Because they were scared not to.
Exactly. And the central government, believing these inflated reports, thought China had this enormous food surplus. So they took huge amounts of grain from the communes for the cities for export, for storage. But there was no surplus. The peasants, who had already lost labor to industry and had their tools melted down, were left with virtually nothing.
Which leads directly to the Great Chinese Famine, 1959 to 62. And this wasn't weather, was it? This was man-made.
Entirely man-made, a direct result of policy. The death toll it's almost impossible to grasp. The most widely accepted estimates are around 30 million people starved to death, primarily peasants. And you had other crazy policies compounding it, like the Four Pests campaign. Mao decided sparrows were eating too much grain, so he ordered the entire country to kill them. People banged pots and pans for days to stop them landing until they dropped dead from exhaustion.
What happened then?
Well, sparrows also eat insects. With the sparrows gone, locusts and other insect populations exploded, devouring even more crops. It was just one disaster layered on another.
Did Mao know how bad it was?
The evidence suggests reports of mass starvation were reaching the leadership pretty early, maybe late 1958. But Mao, initially at least, refused to change course. Ideology trumped reality. There was a key moment at the Lushan Conference in 1959. The defense minister, Peng Dehuai, wrote Mao a private letter gently criticizing the Great Leap. Mao's reaction was furious. He publicly denounced Peng, stripped him of his posts, labeled him a rightist. It sent a chilling message. Even mild criticism at the very top was forbidden.
But the sheer scale of the disaster eventually forced some kind of change. He did step down as president, didn't he?
He did. In 1959, Liu Shaoqi became president. But, and this is crucial, Mao kept his position as chairman of the Communist Party. That was the real seat of power, the ideological authority, control over the military.
So Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, who was general secretary, they were the ones trying to clean up the mess.
Yes. They implemented more pragmatic policies. Quietly started dismantling the communes, allowed small private plots, even imported grain. They basically saved the country from total collapse. But Mao watched this from the sidelines as party chairman, and he saw these reforms not as necessary corrections, but as capitalist betrayal. He started talking about a new ruling elite, a bureaucracy that was losing touch with the revolution. This suspicion festered.
Setting the stage for his next and perhaps most destructive act. His comeback, the Cultural Revolution, starting in 1966.
Right. Mao felt sidelined. He worried the revolution was losing its way, becoming bureaucratic, revisionist like the Soviets. He needed a way to purge his rivals Liu, Deng, their allies, and reignite revolutionary fervor across the country.
So he declares a revolution of culture.
Exactly. He argued China needed continuous revolution to stay pure, to smash the emerging elite, to destroy old ways of thinking that he believed were holding China back.
And he didn't use the army initially, did he? He used the youth.
He mobilized students, teenagers mainly, organized them into the Red Guards, armed them with the Little Red Book and his blessing. Their mission: attack the four olds, old ideas, old culture, old customs, old habits. And they did, with unbelievable violence and chaos. Temples were ransacked, ancient artifacts smashed, books burned, teachers were beaten, intellectuals publicly humiliated. Anyone with bourgeois background was targeted.
It wasn't just symbolic destruction.
Not at all. It was intensely violent. Factional fighting broke out between different Red Guard groups. People were tortured, executed. Millions were persecuted. Liu Shaoqi, the president who had tried to fix the Great Leap mess, was dragged from power, publicly denounced, horribly mistreated, and died miserably in prison. Deng Xiaoping was purged too, sent to work in a factory.
What was the human cost of this period?
Again, the numbers are debated and vast. Some estimates suggest maybe 36 million people were persecuted in the countryside alone during the main years. Death toll estimates range from hundreds of thousands up into the low millions from direct killing, persecution, or suicide. Society was torn apart, families turned against each other. It was 10 years of turmoil, really, lasting until Mao's death. The chaos even reached the very top of the party. Lin Biao, Mao's hand-picked successor, the man who helped build the Mao cult, died in a plane crash in 1971. The official story was he was fleeing after a failed coup attempt against Mao. Whether that's true or not, it shows the paranoia and instability. Even the party itself later had to admit in 1981 that the Cultural Revolution was a severe setback, a massive understatement.
Mao Zedong dies September 9th, 1976, after decades as the paramount leader, the revolutionary, the tyrant. He's gone. But even in death, the control, the symbolism continues. Apparently, he had signed something years before saying he wanted to be cremated. But after he died, no. His body was embalmed, put on permanent display in that huge mausoleum they built for him in Tiananmen Square. It locked him in place, didn't it, as the untouchable founding father?
It absolutely did. It solidified his symbolic status, making open critique even harder. And it brings us right back to that central, incredibly difficult question we grapple with today. How do you weigh the legacy of someone like Mao? The good, the bad, the monumental, and the monstrous. Let's try and lay it out. First, the case for the builder. And this argument is still very powerful, especially within China. You cannot deny he unified the country, ended that century of foreign domination and internal war. That was immense. He oversaw rapid industrialization, built infrastructure, laid the foundation, really, for China's later economic rise. He gave China a powerful sense of national pride, a belief it could stand on its own feet. And those social gains we mentioned earlier, they were real. Life expectancy doubled, literacy soared, women's status improved legally. You have to acknowledge that.
Okay, but then you have to turn the coin over. The case for the destroyer. And this case is overwhelming. When you look at the human cost, historians outside China almost universally describe him as totalitarian, autocratic, someone whose grand vision seemed to make individual human lives expendable. The numbers are just numbing. Credible estimates put the total deaths under his rule from famine, persecution, executions, somewhere between 40 and 70 million people. Think about that. 40 to 70 million. The Great Leap Forward famine alone, the Cultural Revolution's violence, it puts him right up there with the deadliest leaders of the 20th century. So how does China deal with this today? Officially.
Officially, there's the famous verdict delivered by the party after his death. Mao was 70% right and 30% wrong.
70-30. Is that a real historical analysis, or is that just political management? A way to keep the good bits without completely disowning the founder.
It feels overwhelmingly like the latter, doesn't it? It's strategic. It allows them to credit him with the revolution, with founding the PRC, the 70%, while acknowledging the mistakes of the Great Leap and Cultural Revolution, the 30%.
His successor, Deng Xiaoping, the guy Mao purged, then brought back, he kind of summed up the rationale, didn't he?
He did. Deng basically said, look, without him, the Chinese people would have had a much harder time finding the right path out of the darkness. The subtext is crystal clear. If you completely trash Mao, you risk undermining the legitimacy of the entire Communist Party, the entire state he created. He's too foundational to fully repudiate. For the party's survival, he has to remain mostly a hero.
What about outside China? How do historians generally see him?
Well, the focus is heavily on the human cost, obviously. But there's also often an acknowledgement of the sheer scale of what he attempted, and in some ways achieved. The historian John Fairbank had a famous line calling him both a successful creator and ultimately an evil destroyer. Fairbank stressed that the scope of his impact transforming this ancient, vast, fragmented nation, fundamentally changing the lives of a fifth of humanity, is almost unparalleled in modern history. Good or bad, the scale is just immense. Hashtag outro. So we've traced quite a journey today, haven't we? From that idealistic kid in Hunan reading Western philosophy and anarchist texts, to the hardened military strategist surviving the long march. And finally, to the absolute ruler, the chairman whose utopian dreams, pursued relentlessly, led to just unimaginable human suffering. He is, without doubt, the defining figure of modern China. You can't understand China today without understanding Mao.
And his legacy, Maoism itself, it isn't just confined to China, is it? It still echoes. You see young people, sometimes even in the West or in China itself, referencing his ideas to critique inequality or capitalism. You see militant groups in various parts of the world who were, or still are, inspired by his theories of revolution and guerrilla war. His influence persists, sometimes in surprising ways. Which leaves us with the big question for you, listening. When you encounter these colossal figures in history, the ones who reshaped nations, like Mao, how do you make the final judgment? Do you weigh it primarily by the achievements, the unification, the modernization, the social gains, the national pride? Or does the staggering human cost the millions who died in famines, purges, political campaigns, does that become the ultimate measure? Where do you draw the line? How do you balance the builder and the destroyer? Something to think about. Maybe next time we could explore what happened after Mao, the era of Deng Xiaoping, the man who steered China in a radically different direction, famously saying, "It doesn't matter if a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice." That shift from ideology to pragmatism could be our next deep dive.
That sounds fascinating.